Hi, this is Scott Shephard, photo media instructor at Lake Area Technical Institute, and this is a tutorial that I call the difference between taking and making a photograph. I just returned from the Black Hills this past weekend, and as normal, I went out and took photos. And I had a colleague look at this particular photo, which is of Iron Creek, not too far from the cabin that we stay at when we're out there. And they asked this question. They said, "What kind of camera did you use to do that?" I know what they were thinking. They were thinking, well, it must take a special camera to get that kind of photo, because it was clear to me that they like this one. Well, if you're a photographer, you know as well as I do that it's not the camera that is responsible for the photo. It's the photographer and the photographer's know-how. And so I want to give you a little bit of insight into that. Now, my primary tool for in my workflow is a program called Aperture. And I just want to show you what this photo looked like as I took it. Now, because I shoot in RAW, there are a lot of things that the camera is not doing right away to the photo. The camera is not saturating the colors. The camera is not sharpening the edges of the photo. Those are all terms that are part of the photo post-processing process. By the way, the photography is the process and the software is the post-process. And so here's the photo as it was taken right out of the camera. And I'm going to tell you that the thought that went into this photo was that I wanted to get the idea of the water moving. So this is a very special exposure. I had my camera set up on the tripod. I was using a very low ISO. An f-stop on this lens. It was the 70 to 200 millimeter lens that I was using of f32, and this is an 8-second exposure, which is to say that the camera shutter stayed open for a long time. This is kind of an extreme for me on this particular tripod set up in this particular stream, because you have to be very careful about camera shake even when you're on a tripod. One thing about this photo that you'll notice is that the colors are really kind of dull. It was actually an overcast day. It was fairly early in the day, but I can adjust that using Aperture. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is just kind of play a little bit with the color temperature. I didn't use a gray card or anything like that, so I'm just kind of curious about the white balance. I could warm this up. I could cool it down, and in fact, that's kind of my inclination, is to make this a little bit cooler. I want the water to be nice and blue if I can. So I'm going to set the white balance to that, 47, 41. Those numbers really aren't important to me and probably aren't important to you. And then I'm going to adjust the saturation. Now, this is where you start to see an impact of the software on the photo. And actually, I'm going to saturate this quite a bit because, as I say, it was kind of a dull day. And you notice how these colors are coming to life now in this photo. Now, there's one other thing that I want to do in Aperture before I leave it. And it is, I want to adjust the photo just in terms of its angle a little bit. I think it's tilted just a bit. Now, if you wonder what I'm looking at, I'm looking right here, which I think would be the water level. And so that line in my head needs to be straight. Now, this is a very subtle adjustment, but I'm using that grid and the straighten tool in Aperture to affect the picture. Okay, so there you have it. There's the adjusted version. Now, the next step is to open this up in Photoshop. So Aperture I use primarily for organizing, for white balance, for saturation, straightening, things like that. But Photoshop becomes the tool that I use for the rest of the process here. Okay, so here it is opened up in Photoshop. Now, if you were to look at the final version of this particular photo, you'll notice that it's different from what we're seeing in Photoshop. And the difference is that I have cropped it. The intent of the crop was really to try to focus on the water and a little bit less on all of this jumble along the side of the creek. And so that's really a simple matter. Now, I don't know that I can crop this exactly the way it was cropped here, but I'll give it a try. I think the crop goes roughly. And by the way, the crop that I'm using in this particular case is a crop that I use for turning my photos into a desktop. And so you'll notice that I'm cutting out probably about 30% of the photo here. And I hit enter, and now we have the crop. Okay, now there are a few other things that I would do in Photoshop, but I'm not going to waste your time showing them to you. The last thing I want to show you really is something having to do with contrast. If I go up to Image Adjust Levels, now this actually shows me the exposure of the photo, and it's actually a fairly well exposed photo. In an ideal histogram, as this is called, it should start way over here, which is the pure black, and it should end way over there, which is pure white. And I'm just going to adjust the black part of this picture. Now you can see that it's fairly subtle, but it is adjusting the contrast. It's making the difference between bright and dark a little bit more noticeable. In fact, in this case, I don't very often do this. Now the secret here is that I want to make it a little bit darker, but I don't want to lose the detail in the shadows here. That's pretty important to me. I don't like just total pure black in a photo. And I think that's going to do it. That's a fairly subtle adjustment. Now, let's go back in the history and take a look at this. There I've adjusted the levels. There's before, there's after. Not extreme, but there is a difference. Now, there's one last thing that we need to do here, and that is that we need to sharpen it. Sharpening actually is a process that defines the edges of objects. And I'm going to go up to Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. If you ask me how I know this, the answer is that I read it in a book, and it's worked. I've used it for years. The amount I set somewhere around 175% to 212%. Let's just leave it at 175. I use the threshold in my workflow is always set at 2, and the radius is one I adjust more often. And the secret here is this: if you can easily over sharpen a photo, and it gets really ugly. Now you may have some reason to want to do that to a photo. In my case, here it is just hardly sharpened at all, but I'm going to crank this up to about 0.8. And I think you can see this. Where you're really going to see the difference is in the fine detail of a photo. So we're going to say 175%, 0.72 for this particular crop. Now, by the way, the sharpening in my workflow always comes after the crop. And there we have it. Now, incidentally, I want you to notice, let's look at these pine needles right here. And there's the sharpened version, and there's the unsharp version. And you're noticing right away that the detail comes alive in these needles, and that's where the sharpening makes the biggest difference. You look back here and you can see the same thing. The smooth rock isn't necessarily something you're going to see a big difference in, but look at the needles on the rock. Before sharpening, after sharpening. Okay, so there's the final version. Now, if you look at the version that I did the other day, you'll notice that this is even a little bit brighter, a little bit sharper, because I spent a little bit more time. If you ask me how much time do I spend on a photo, the answer is that it often takes me about a half an hour on something like this. Now, the last thing I would do is that I am going to convert this to an 8-bit image. That number may not be important to you right now, but the raw file as it comes out of Aperture is a huge file with lots of color information. I'm going to throw half of that information away by converting it to an 8-bit version, and then I'm going to throw even more color away by converting it to a JPEG file. You won't really see the difference. For example, that's a JPEG, but it's a much smaller file. Anyway, that's a little bit about how I make a photo. It's not the camera, if you ask me. The camera helps, but it's the photographer and the knowledge and skill set that the photographer has that helps you make a photo. Thanks for listening.